Hello guys, this is the AI Founders Mindset. Sorry, it's long name. Anyway, today's episode, this is a conversation with Deepak, part 2. Me personally, I love it, this conversation, because he is a entrepreneur and also engineer and also as a father. He talked about AI with kids education and also how to utilize AI to update our skill and also how important writing skill in this AI era. So if you are watching our episode on YouTube, please subscribe it and then please like it. It's super helpful. Anyway, let's get started. 行きましょう.
So this is something very important for our audience to understand, that AI systems, whatever they say is not truth sometimes. So whatever you read, you have to cross question. It is like a kid who is trying to impress you. So it will say anything to make sure, you are impressed. So you have to understand, you have to read it, you have to be responsible for it, that whether that information is correct, does it even make sense or not. And there are ways to make sure you can do that. So whenever ChatGPT is giving you information, you can ask a qualifying question. Prove me what you're saying is actually correct. Or you contradict the information. And that is how you can come back to a decision whether this information is correct or not.
Many people tend to believe everything 100% from ChatGPT or other model, but definitely they have a bias because these models created by Silicon Valley big corporates, right? Not like Hindu speakers, not Japanese small tribal language specialists. By the way, just my personal curiosity, do you use AI in your private and something like work routine?
Yes, we are using AI every day. We have actually spent weeks training engineers how to use AI to write better code, ask themselves new questions. That's why even though our engineering team is younger in average age, but they are working like an expert who is into the industry for almost 10 years. I'm teaching my kids like what should happen with AI. So my attitude towards them is, don't worry about learning things. Worry about asking the right question. With the world of AI, knowledge is commodity. It is as simple as you going into a library and you're buying the entire row of books into a USB drive. But thing is, now how do you extract value out of that collection of books? That is where you need to come up with the right mindset of a framework where you ask all the right questions and follow-up questions. So the art of right question, asking the right question, is what I'm trying to teach my kids with AI as a tool. I'm not trying to basically keep them away. So that's important for people to also look into that. How can they use AI? To me, if you have the smartest person with you as your assistant, what are you going to do with him? I mean, are you only going to ask them point questions, or are you going to discuss with them, walk with them? I mean, I walk with ChatGPT all the time on my walks, and I do self-reflection with it, which is amazing.
Self-reflection?
Yes.
I love that. Please tell us about it.
For example, if there is a topic which is bothering you, you talk to it and then ask it saying, hey, you are my psychotherapist or whatever. Not a medical advice, obviously, but then I need help on this. What do you think? Walk me through the framework. And then the way you get some insight is amazing. Right, and sometimes design problems. Hey, I have to solve a software problem where this and that is needed. How do I go about it? So having a more structured response, even though it is not correct all the time, but still, even if it's 90% correct, great. At least you had another smart person to talk to, which is not gonna tell anybody. It's a AI bot, right? So that way, there are ways which people can leverage AI today.
I see. Okay, so mostly you are using ChatGPT.
No, ChatGPT is there, then there is Perplexity, and there is like Gemini from Google and all that. So I have all three. I have Microsoft Copilot as well. So I use them for different things. I mean, obviously reflections and stuff, writing things. Then sometime in the early days, there was a lot of imagination. Oh, what if I am a great artist and I can draw an image, right? But now you don't have to be a great artist. All you have to be is a person who can describe it well.
Yeah.
And then AI can generate an image for you. So I practice that. I ask my kids to do the same, because idea is they need to have the creativity where they are describing it to a system, and the system can do it. So if you're really thinking about it with this approach, you are actually mentoring and growing future leaders. So if you think about actually a great leader is not the one who know how to solve it, is the one who can describe the picture to the person who's going to do it. in the best possible way. So that is what some these days we are called prompt engineering.
I see. Okay, so you and your kids are kind of daily routine or practicing how to describe to AI to generate something art and also some creative
Sometimes
writing.
poems, right? Hey, how about if I need to get a poem on any random topic? Maybe you are sitting in a park and then, hey, how can you get me a poem which is appropriate for a park and setup and stuff? How do you get that? Because that's the creative juice. Because that is what a leader needs, if you really think about it. Right? Their job is not to know how to solve it. Their job is to, first of all, come up with an idea of what to solve and then measure its merits and then articulate to the person who's going to solve it. So that's what I'm trying to do with my kids, at least.
I love that. This is good practice to describe and storytelling. Okay. By the way, so have you ever used your country's language on ChatGPT?
Yes, that we actually even did before.
Is this which language?
Hindi.
Hindi. Okay.
So I know 3. So I tried it in all 3. It works. It works amazing.
ChatGPT can understand and they speak.
Yes. So they have a voice module through which you can talk in your native language, and it will very well understand it and then solve the job. As an exercise, I built this mobile app. I was never a mobile developer. Within, I think, 48 or 72 hours, I was able to build an app where I can scan any food label and convert that into some nutritional recommendation. So I actually scanned a lot of Chinese and Japanese food as well, because you can't understand anything.
For example, if this is Japanese,
you take
noodle,
a photo, exactly. You take a photo of it, and then it will describe exactly what is in there, and then you can even tell that, hey, tell me exactly what is this ingredients, and then are they good for me, are they bad for me? Go search on the internet, and then come back with a report whether should I even eat it or not. So there is a lot of amazing things people can do with AI. You just have to come up with the problem and then sit in front of the system. That nobody can take. You have to sit. So I think in this new era, the future is about people who are disciplined, who are punctual, and can spend time with AI. And I'm sure they will generate great values if they put their head to it.
Amazing, thank you. So by the way, so the reason why I asked you about how to communicate with large language model using our country language, because when I asked something Japanese tradition on ChatGPT, of course, almost all good answer, but some of them, they gave me a wrong answer.
Yeah.
So how is specific Indian culture stuff?
So you bring it a very good point, right? So all these large language models have been optimized for English. That has been because that is what the people who are developing.
English-centric.
English-centric, right? And then everything else is a addition on top of it. We need to have Arabic, we need to have Hindi, we need to have Japanese, Chinese. You talk about it, all the languages, right? So the quality of results you're going to get is going to vary. But it's only getting better. But what this brings to is a very important aspect is, if I say, for example, if I do not know Japanese, whatever it's going to say to me, because I'm reading in English, if you think about it, I'm going to believe it. Yeah. But since you know Japanese culture and everything, you can say, this is a lie, this is wrong, this is right. So this is something very important for our audience to understand, that AI systems, whatever they say is not truth sometimes. So whatever you read, you have to cross question. It is like a kid who is trying to impress you. So it will say anything to make sure, you are impressed. So you have to understand, you have to read it, you have to be responsible for it, that whether that information is correct, does it even make sense or not. And there are ways to make sure you can do that. So whenever ChatGPT is giving you information, you can ask a qualifying question. Prove me what you're saying is actually correct. Or you contradict the information. And that is how you figure out whether the system is lying to you or is just basically making fake stuff up, fictitious stuff. And that is how you can come back to a decision whether this information is correct or not.
I see. This is important because many people, including me, tend to believe everything 100% from ChatGPT or other model. But this is definitely they have a bias. But because these models created by Silicon Valley big corporates, right? Not like a specific Hindu speakers, not a specific Japanese small tribal language or specialist. So we have to like make sure. Yeah.
Yep. I mean, a good example of that would be is, for example, if you go to countries which have, people, average height of people are very small, like, South Asia and all that. And if that is the country which is building aeroplanes and they have never seen America or any other country or Africa where people are really, really tall, they are going to make everything so small because that's the average height. Hey,
like a house.
Exactly. Right? So because that's all you have seen. It's called information bias, right? Information bias, right? And you only build or program for what you know. So Silicon Valley knows English. It understands American culture, and then that's what it focuses on. And then from there it builds a business, and then that is what it's trying to sell to the entire world. So sometimes people who are non-native English speaking or cultures which is trying to use these engines, they have to really, even English speaking, forget the Japanese and the Indian stuff, right? Even English speaking folks who are using this, you have to use it with a grain of salt, that the information may not be truth. So always double check it.
I see. Yeah, you are right. Always we had better to double check. And also, I felt if we make something organization, we had better to invite not the pure American people like us, like what can I say? Diversity is so important.
That is why if you see a lot of the companies like Google, Facebook and big companies, they are stressing on diversity. It's called DE, diversity and equity. This is the important piece, because if you're not going to have people from different culture, and not just, it's not about skin, color, religion, it's about different mindset. I mean, if you think about a culture brings a different mindset, a religion brings a different mindset, a gender brings a different mindset. I mean, you're a woman and I'm a man, we all think differently, right? We are not looking at the world in the same way, even though we believe we are not. And that is very important when we are all solving the problem, because when you're designing something, you're going to say, hey, what about tall people? What about small people? What about, broad people and all that? And then that is how you come up with an average dimension of like maybe an airline seat, right? So now imagine a software which is almost trying to act like a human. How complicated it is, right? There are so many challenges on the AI side of it, from ethics. There was this funny question which a friend of mine asked me once. What is the religion of AI? Is it Christian? Is it Islam? I do not know. AI is going to be what people are going to ask it to become, right? So that's very important to understand. It's a software built by people. It's unlike any other technology, like guns, right? I mean, they can keep you safe, they can kill you. It depends how you use it. So you have to be careful from spammers, hackers, and all the other people who are going to use the AI technology to spam you and steal information, money, and anything else from you, because that's what they do. And they are only getting better with this technology. Same thing goes for good people, because they are trying to make the world better with the same technology, right? So you have, like, in this world of AI, we have to use it so that we understand and we are current with like all the bad stuff which people can do with this, and the good stuff people can do it. And we can choose. If I am a bad guy somewhere, sure, I'm going to learn AI to see how can I steal everybody's credit card information. If I'm a good guy, maybe I'm going to think about how to stop it. Or maybe nobody have to work, right? So stuff like this. So it's a technology, just use it the way you feel, but you can't close eyes on it. You have to be aware of it, you have to learn it, and you have to agree to it that it's going to be part of your life very soon and very fast.
I see. Thank you so much. You are right. Yeah. So AI is like improving super fast. So we have to chase and we have to like learn, and also we need to have a conversation with people who has many aspects.
Absolutely, right? So having a difference of opinion is very important, and that is where if you think about AI, ChatGPT and all that comes in, right? We all have this tendency of talking to friends and families where they don't agree with our thoughts, and somehow they becomes bad because they did not agree to your thought process. But that is where AI comes in, because when you are talking to systems like that, they can disagree to you, but it's not a human face, so you're not going to get pissed at it, and then therefore you can have more meaningful, unbiased conversations. So I would say people should try this. Go on an evening walk, open ChatGPT or any other AI tool which is available, wherever you are listening from, and have a conversation and see. You will feel like you're having a conversation with a very intelligent person. But at the same time, keep in mind that intelligent person have a heart of a child, and it is going to try to impress you with truth and lie both. So you have to make sure you are taking values of truth and keeping yourself safe from the lies.
I see. Thank you so much, Deepak. Thank you so much for this amazing your wisdom and conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. See you guys.
Okay, bye. The 3 key takeaways from a conversation with Deepak, part 2. Okay? 1. The art of asking and iterating the right questions. In the age of AI, the key skill is describing requirement effectively to large language models to achieve desired outcome, whether generating art, finding correct answers, creative writing, or conducting research. So, we need to have writing skill. Deepak emphasized the importance of iterating and refining prompts, continually improving how we interact with AI to maximize its potential. Yes. 2. Diversity, responsible AI usage, and fact-checking. AI systems are shaped by their creators' culture and linguistic bias, making it vital to approach their output with skepticism. Fact-checking is essential before publishing or rely on AI-generated content, ensuring accuracy and reliability. Diversity in teams also helps reducing bias, creating AI solutions that effectively serve broader audience. 3. Integrating AI into everyday life. Deepak highlights importance of using AI as a tool for personal and professional growth. Individuals can unlock new possibility and engaging with AI tool for creative tasks, problem solving, and self-reflection while staying aware of AI's limitations and ethical concerns. AI is not magical. We have to have the practice to describe what I want, what kind of output we want, right? So communication skill or describing skill is so important. Thank you so much for watching our episode today. We hope Deepak's conversation will help your future and career. Okay, ciao, bye bye.